My daughter-in-law, Jessica, stood at the head of my dining room table, carving the turkey I had spent 16 hours preparing, while explaining to her parents how she'd been up since dawn, perfecting her grandmother's secret recipe. The same recipe I'd taught her 3 weeks ago from my own handwritten cards. My son Michael nodded proudly as Jessica described the herb blend she'd supposedly created, watching her serve portions to guests in my own home while I stood in the kitchen doorway like hired help. That's when my youngest son David walked through the front door, phone in hand, and announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Mom, should I upload that cooking footage now?" The 3-day time-lapse turned out incredible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Linda Martinez, and at 58, I thought I'd earned the right to be respected in my own kitchen. After raising 3 boys as a single mother in Phoenix, working double shifts as a nurse to keep food on the table, I'd finally reached the point where cooking had become my joy instead of my burden. My Scottsdale ranch house with its spacious kitchen and granite counters represented everything I'd worked toward. The copper pots hanging from the rack above my island weren't just cookware. They were trophies of a life built from nothing into something beautiful. When my eldest son Michael announced his engagement to Jessica 3 years ago, I welcomed her with open arms and an open recipe box. She seemed genuinely interested in learning family traditions, asking thoughtful questions about my grandmother's tamale technique and taking careful notes when I showed her how to make my famous green chili stew. I was thrilled to finally have a daughter figure in my life, someone who might carry forward the culinary legacy I'd spent decades perfecting. The first red flag should have been obvious, but love makes us blind to warning signs we'd normally catch immediately. Jessica moved into my home in August with 3 suitcases and an attitude that suggested she was doing me a favor. Michael explained that their apartment lease had ended unexpectedly, and they needed somewhere to stay while house hunting. "Just a few months," he promised, looking at me with those same pleading eyes he'd used as a child when asking for extra. "Dessert?" Jessica swept through my front door like she was surveying a hotel she might consider purchasing. She examined my living room arrangement with the critical eye of a designer, commenting that the furniture placement felt cramped and outdated. Within hours, she'd rearranged my coffee table, moved my favorite reading chair to a corner where it blocked the window, and suggested we needed better lighting to create proper ambiance. That first evening, while I prepared dinner for 3, Jessica disappeared into my kitchen and began opening every cabinet and drawer, with the methodical precision of someone conducting an inventory. She pulled out my spice jars, examined the labels, and started reorganizing them according to what she called a more logical system. When I mentioned that I preferred my cumin next to my chili powder since I used them together frequently, she smiled patronizingly and explained that alphabetical organization was more efficient for serious cooking. The next morning, I woke to find Jessica already in my kitchen at 6 a.m., music blasting from her phone while she attempted to make what she called artisanal avocado toast. The counter looked like a war zone, with breadcrumbs scattered across the granite, avocados smeared on my cutting board, and 3 different knives dirty in the sink. When I offered to help clean up, she waved me away cheerfully, saying she'd handle it later because she was running late for a client meeting. Later never came. I spent 20 minutes scrubbing avocado residue off surfaces while Jessica applied makeup in the guest bathroom, singing along to her playlist without a care in the world. When I mentioned the cleanup to Michael that evening, he shrugged and said Jessica was adjusting to a new space, and we should give her time to find her rhythm. By the second week, Jessica's morning kitchen takeovers had become routine. She'd wake up before me, claim the entire space for her breakfast preparation, and leave behind a disaster that somehow always needed immediate attention because she'd used my good dishes or left sticky substances on my appliances. When I suggested we coordinate our morning schedules to avoid conflicts, she looked genuinely confused and asked why I needed the kitchen so early when I was retired. The assumption stung because it revealed how she viewed my life. Yes, I'd left. my nursing career the previous year after 35 years of caring for others. But retirement didn't mean irrelevance. My days were full of volunteer work at the community center, maintaining my garden, and pursuing the photography hobby I'd never had time for during my working years. Most importantly, I still cooked elaborate meals for my family every week, hosting Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations that had become cherished traditions. Jessica's third week brought the first direct challenge to my authority in my own home. I returned from grocery shopping to find her in my kitchen with her laptop open, surrounded by printed recipes and my collection of handwritten family cards. She explained brightly that she was planning to cook dinner for Michael as a surprise, and she'd borrowed a few of my recipes to inspire her menu. The word borrowed felt wrong immediately, but I couldn't articulate why without seeming petty. I watched her photograph my grandmother's mole recipe with her phone, commenting that she wanted to preserve it digitally in case the card got damaged. Something cold settled in my stomach as she handled the yellowed index card my grandmother had written in careful Spanish cursive 60 years ago. This wasn't preservation. It felt like appropriation. That evening, Jessica presented Michael with what she called her interpretation of traditional Mexican flavors. The mole sauce she served was recognizably my grandmother's recipe, down to the specific combination of 3 different chilies and the touch of chocolate that made it distinctive. Michael praised her creativity and natural cooking instincts while I sat silently, watching my family's culinary heritage being rebranded as Jessica's innovative fusion cuisine. When I complimented the dish and mentioned its similarity to my grandmother's recipe, Jessica smiled sweetly and said she'd been inspired by our conversation, but had made several improvements to modernize the flavors. The improvements were salt and an extra pinch of cumin, changes so minor they barely qualified as adjustments, let alone innovations worthy of claiming ownership. Michael beamed at Jessica throughout dinner, telling her she was becoming quite the chef and suggesting she consider starting a food blog to share her discoveries with the world. I felt something shift inside me that night, a recognition that this wasn't innocent enthusiasm for cooking. This was calculated appropriation of my identity, my skills, and my family's traditions. The pattern accelerated through September. Jessica would watch me cook with intense focus, asking detailed questions about techniques and timing while claiming she wanted to learn traditional methods. She'd take notes in a leather journal she carried everywhere, documenting not just ingredients, but my personal shortcuts and the stories behind each recipe. Then she'd disappear for a day or two, only to return with a perfectly executed version of whatever I'd prepared, presented to Michael as her latest culinary experiment. My pozole became her interpretation of authentic soup traditions. My chilis, rellenos transformed into her modern take on stuffed peppers. Even my simple weeknight quesadillas evolved into her signature cheese-filled tortilla creations. Each time, Michael would marvel at Jessica's natural talent and rapid improvement. In the kitchen, he'd compare her favorably to his friends' wives, praising her domestic skills and suggesting she was the kind of woman who could make any house feel like a home. The irony was devastating, because she was making my house feel less like home every day. October brought Jessica's first attempt at hosting. She invited her book club to meet at our house without asking my permission, simply announcing over breakfast that 12 women would be arriving Thursday evening for wine and discussion. When I asked about the refreshment plans, she explained, confidently, that she'd handle everything because she wanted to showcase her developing cooking skills. Thursday afternoon, I returned from my volunteer shift at the food bank to find Jessica frantically searching through my recipe collection, while something burned on the stove. Her confident hosting had dissolved into panic when she realized she'd bitten off more than she could chew. The appetizers she'd attempted were disasters. The wine glasses were spotted with water stains, and she hadn't considered that 12 women would need somewhere to sit. Without being asked, I stepped in to salvage the evening. I quickly prepared a platter of my reliable crowd pleasers while Jessica showered and changed clothes. I arranged additional seating from the dining room, set up a proper wine service, and even put together a small dessert display from ingredients I kept on hand for emergencies. When the book club arrived, Jessica greeted them at the door wearing a fresh outfit and a bright smile, accepting compliments on the beautiful spread as if she'd been working in the kitchen all afternoon. I served the food and refilled wine glasses, while remaining invisible, watching Jessica bask in praise for my work while I played the role of helpful background support. That night marked the beginning of Jessica's systematic campaign to position herself as the domestic goddess while relegating me to kitchen assistant status. She began volunteering my services for tasks that supported her image while claiming credit for outcomes I produced. When Michael's co-workers came for dinner, Jessica planned elaborate menus that required my execution while she focused on being the charming hostess. The genius of her approach was its subtlety. She never directly ordered me around or openly claimed superior skills. Instead, she created situations where I naturally stepped in to help, then gracefully accepted credit for collaborative efforts while minimizing my contributions. To outside observers, we appeared to be a harmonious household where the younger woman was blossoming under the guidance of an experienced cook who was happy to share knowledge. The truth was more insidious. Jessica was systematically studying and stealing everything that made me valuable to this family, then replacing me in that role while keeping me around as unpaid labor. She was erasing my identity as the family, matriarch one recipe at a time, positioning herself as the new generation's domestic leader while treating me like a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected. By early November, Jessica's confidence had grown bold enough for direct challenges to my authority. She began making suggestions about how I could improve my cooking techniques, offering tips she'd learned from cooking shows or food blogs. She'd taste my dishes and suggest modifications that would make them more contemporary or health-conscious, as if my decades of experience needed correction from someone who'd been cooking seriously for 3 months. The suggestions always came wrapped in compliments and framed as collaborative improvements rather than criticisms. She'd praise my traditional methods while explaining how modern techniques could enhance the results. She'd acknowledge my experience while introducing new approaches that might appeal to younger palates. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. My way of doing things was outdated and needed her guidance to remain relevant. Michael absorbed these interactions without recognizing their underlying power dynamic. To him, Jessica appeared to be respectfully learning from his mother while contributing her own fresh perspective to family traditions. He saw collaboration where I experienced colonization, viewing Jessica's suggestions as evidence of her thoughtfulness rather than signs of her ambition to replace me. The breaking point approached as Thanksgiving planning began. Jessica announced that she wanted to host her first major holiday as part of the family, suggesting it would be meaningful for her to demonstrate her commitment to our traditions. She proposed taking the lead on menu planning and preparation, while graciously allowing me to assist with the more labor-intensive tasks. The role reversal was complete and devastating. In my own home, using my own recipes, cooking my own food, I was being relegated to sous chef status while Jessica assumed the position of head chef. The woman who had never successfully prepared a meal without my intervention was positioning herself as the leader of a celebration that had been my domain for 35 years. When I expressed concern about the complexity of preparing Thanksgiving dinner for 12 people, Jessica assured me that she'd been researching techniques and felt confident in her abilities. She'd planned everything carefully, she explained, and my experience would be invaluable in helping her execute her vision successfully. My decades of hosting were being reframed as helpful assistance to her leadership debut. The final insult came when Jessica suggested inviting her parents to experience what she called our family's authentic holiday traditions. She wanted to showcase the cooking skills she'd developed and share the recipes she'd learned, presenting herself as the keeper of culinary knowledge she'd actually stolen from me. She planned to perform my identity in front of an audience while I watched from the sidelines, applauding her appropriation of everything I'd worked to create. That night, lying awake in my own bed while listening to Jessica and Michael plan her Thanksgiving triumph in the next room, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to fight Jessica's takeover with arguments or confrontations that would make me look petty and jealous. Instead, I was going to document the truth so thoroughly that no one could deny what was really happening in my kitchen. I was going to let Jessica hang herself with her own rope, and I was going to make sure everyone could see exactly how long that rope really was. The morning after my sleepless night of decision-making, I woke with newfound clarity about what needed to happen. Instead of continuing to absorb Jessica's increasingly bold appropriations in silence, I would begin building an irrefutable record of exactly what transpired in my kitchen each day. The plan forming in my mind required patience and precision. But after 3 decades as a nurse dealing with difficult personalities and complex situations, I understood the value of careful documentation. I started by visiting my neighbor Maria, who worked as a freelance videographer for local businesses. Under the pretense of wanting to document family recipes for future generations, I asked her advice about setting up discreet recording equipment in my kitchen. Maria was delighted to help, understanding immediately the sentimental value of preserving cooking traditions. She suggested several small wireless cameras that could be positioned to capture the entire kitchen workspace without being obvious to casual observers. While Maria helped me install the equipment that afternoon, Jessica was out shopping for what she called inspiration ingredients for her upcoming Thanksgiving masterpiece. The cameras were tiny and sophisticated, barely noticeable when positioned strategically behind decorative items on my shelves. Maria showed me how to access the footage through an app on my phone, explaining that everything would be automatically saved to cloud storage with timestamps that would prove exactly when each cooking session occurred. That evening, Jessica returned home with bags full of specialty items from the gourmet market, excitedly showing Michael her purchases while explaining her vision for elevating traditional Thanksgiving flavors. She'd bought truffle oil, exotic mushrooms, and imported cheeses, ingredients that had nothing to do with the family recipes she planned to prepare, but everything to do with impressing her parents with her sophisticated palate. As she unpacked her expensive ingredients, Jessica casually mentioned that she'd been researching professional cooking techniques online and felt ready to tackle more complex preparations. She'd watched several celebrity chef tutorials, she explained, and was eager to apply what she'd learned to our family recipes. The way she said our family recipes made my skin crawl, as if 3 months of residence had made her an equal inheritor of traditions passed down through 4 generations. Michael encouraged her enthusiasm, suggesting she document her cooking process for the food blog she'd been talking about starting. The irony was almost too perfect. While Jessica planned to document her performance of my recipes for public consumption, I would be documenting the reality of who actually did the work behind the scenes. The next few days established a routine that would define our relationship through Thanksgiving. Each morning, Jessica would emerge from the guest bedroom with grand plans for the day's culinary experiments, armed with printouts from cooking websites and lists of techniques she wanted to master. She'd claim the kitchen as her laboratory, spreading ingredients and equipment across every available surface while describing her intended approach to whatever dish had captured her imagination. I would listen patiently to her explanations, offering gentle guidance when she misunderstood basic techniques or overlooked crucial steps. She'd accept my suggestions graciously, thanking me for sharing my experience while clearly viewing me as a helpful consultant rather than the actual expert whose knowledge she was borrowing. The cameras captured every interaction, documenting not just what we cooked together, but the dynamic between teacher and student that Jessica consistently misrepresented to others. What emerged from these sessions was a pattern of collaborative creation that Jessica would later claim as solo achievement. I'd guide her through the fundamental steps of preparing complex dishes, explaining the reasoning behind each technique and the family history that had shaped our traditional methods. She'd follow my instructions carefully, asking intelligent questions and taking detailed notes in her leather journal. But when the dishes were complete and Michael arrived home from work, Jessica would present them as evidence of her developing expertise. She'd describe the challenges she'd overcome and the creative decisions she'd made, minimizing my role to occasional advice giving while positioning herself as the primary architect of each success. Michael would taste the results and praise Jessica's natural talent, never thinking to ask how much guidance she'd received or whose techniques had actually produced the flavors he enjoyed. The cameras documented this revisionist history in real time, showing the vast difference between Jessica's actual contributions and the credit she claimed afterward. While she certainly participated in the cooking process and learned quickly, her role was always that of an eager student following detailed instruction rather than an innovative chef developing original recipes. More troubling was Jessica's systematic documentation of everything I taught her. Her leather journal became a comprehensive record of family recipes, cooking techniques, and cultural traditions that had taken me decades to learn and perfect. She photographed every handwritten recipe card, noting not just ingredients and measurements, but the personal touches that made each dish distinctive to our family's version. When I expressed mild concern about her extensive note-taking, Jessica explained that she wanted to preserve these precious traditions for future generations. She spoke eloquently about the importance of maintaining cultural heritage and ensuring that valuable knowledge wouldn't be lost over time. Her words were beautiful, and her intentions sounded noble, but the result was still the systematic appropriation of intellectual property that belonged to my family's history. The most insidious aspect of Jessica's approach was how she gradually began suggesting improvements to traditional recipes. Initially, her modifications were minor adjustments based on contemporary dietary preferences or ingredient availability. She'd propose using Greek yogurt instead of sour cream for health benefits, or suggest substituting maple syrup for refined sugar to create more complex flavors. These suggestions came wrapped in respect for tradition and framed as ways to honor the original recipes while making them more accessible to modern palates. Jessica never criticized my grandmother's methods directly or implied that traditional approaches were wrong. Instead, she positioned herself as a bridge between old and new, someone who could preserve cultural heritage while adapting it for contemporary relevance. Michael embraced these innovations enthusiastically, viewing Jessica's suggestions as evidence of her creativity and cultural sensitivity. He'd taste her modified versions of family recipes and declare them improvements, praising her ability to honor tradition while adding her own special touch. Each time he preferred Jessica's adaptation over my original version, I felt another piece of my culinary identity being transferred to her ownership. The November weeks became an intensive training period where Jessica absorbed not just recipes and techniques, but the stories and cultural significance behind each dish. She'd ask thoughtful questions about the origins of specific traditions, the regional variations that influenced our family's methods, and the historical context that had shaped our approach to holiday cooking. I found myself sharing memories I'd never discussed before, telling Jessica about my grandmother's childhood in Sonora and the economic circumstances that had influenced our family's resourceful cooking style. I explained how certain ingredients had been substituted over generations based on availability and cost, and how special occasion dishes had evolved to accommodate different family sizes and dietary needs. Jessica absorbed these stories with apparent reverence, expressing gratitude for being trusted with family history and promising to carry forward the traditions with appropriate respect. She spoke movingly about the honor of being welcomed into our cultural heritage and the responsibility she felt to preserve these precious memories for her future children. But as Thanksgiving approached, it became clear that Jessica's interest in our family traditions was entirely extractive. She wanted to possess our cultural heritage without understanding the lived experience that had created it. She could replicate my grandmother's mole recipe perfectly, but she'd never spent childhood afternoons grinding chilies by hand or learned to judge doneness by smell, because ingredients were too expensive to waste on mistakes. Jessica's relationship with our food traditions was academic rather than emotional, based on study rather than memory. She could execute the techniques flawlessly and even suggest improvements that enhanced flavors, but she lacked the deep connection. that came from growing up within the culture that had created these dishes. Her appreciation was genuine but superficial, focused on results rather than the process of cultural transmission that had shaped my understanding of cooking as love made visible. The week before Thanksgiving, Jessica announced that she'd invited her parents to join our celebration, explaining that she wanted to share the authentic cultural experience she'd been learning about. She described our family traditions with the enthusiasm of an anthropologist who'd made fascinating discoveries, eager to display her knowledge to an audience who would appreciate her scholarly efforts. When she called her mother Carol to extend the invitation, I listened from the next room as Jessica described the elaborate menu she was planning and the traditional techniques she'd mastered. She spoke confidently about her preparations, mentioning specific dishes and explaining their cultural significance with the authority of someone who'd always been part of these traditions, rather than someone who'd learned about them over the past few months. Carol expressed admiration for Jessica's domestic skills and cultural appreciation, praising her daughter for embracing her new family's heritage with such dedication. She mentioned how impressed Jessica's father Tom would be to see her cooking abilities, since he'd always appreciated good food but never expected Jessica to develop such sophisticated culinary skills. The conversation revealed Jessica's long-term strategy with crystalline clarity. She wasn't just appropriating my recipes and techniques for personal use within our household. She was building a public identity as a culturally knowledgeable cook who could represent our family's traditions to the outside world. Her parents would witness her performance of my expertise and assume she'd developed these skills independently, giving her credibility that she could leverage in future social and professional situations. As Jessica continued describing her Thanksgiving plans to her mother, I realized that this celebration would serve as her formal debut as the family's new culinary leader. She'd invited an audience specifically to witness her mastery of traditions she'd stolen, using my own home as the stage for a performance that would establish her credentials as the keeper of our cultural heritage. The audacity was breathtaking, but so was the sophistication of her approach. Jessica had studied not just my recipes and techniques, but the entire cultural context that gave them meaning. She could speak knowledgeably about ingredients, preparation methods, and historical significance because she'd systematically extracted that information from me over months of seemingly innocent conversations. More importantly, she'd positioned herself as the natural successor to my role as family matriarch by demonstrating apparent respect for tradition while suggesting contemporary improvements. To outside observers, Jessica appeared to be the perfect daughter-in-law who honored her husband's heritage while bringing fresh perspective to old ways of doing things. The cameras captured all of this cultural theft in detail, but I knew that documentation alone wouldn't be sufficient to expose Jessica's deception. Too many people would view her behavior as admirable cultural appreciation rather than systematic appropriation. I needed something more dramatic than evidence of gradual theft. I needed to catch Jessica in an undeniable lie that would reveal the gap between her claims and her actual abilities. That opportunity would come during Thanksgiving preparation itself, when Jessica's performance would have to match her promises under the pressure of preparing multiple complex dishes simultaneously. I suspected that her confidence was built on controlled circumstances where she'd learned one recipe at a time with my guidance. Managing an entire holiday menu without assistance would reveal the limitations of her stolen knowledge. The final piece of my strategy involved my youngest son, David, who'd always been more observant than Michael about family dynamics. David worked in digital marketing and understood the power of visual evidence in contemporary communication. When he called to confirm his attendance at Thanksgiving dinner, I mentioned that I was documenting the cooking process for family history purposes and asked if he'd help me create a comprehensive record of our holiday preparations. David enthusiastically agreed to document everything with professional quality video equipment, thinking he was helping preserve family memories rather than building evidence for exposing fraud. His presence would provide independent witness to whatever transpired during Thanksgiving preparation, ensuring that my documentation couldn't be dismissed as biased or manipulated. As the final week before Thanksgiving arrived, Jessica's excitement reached fever pitch. She created detailed schedules for food preparation, assigned herself responsibility for all the signature dishes, and began shopping for ingredients with the confidence of someone who'd been managing holiday meals for years rather than months. I maintained my supportive facade while preparing for the most important performance of my life. Jessica had spent months studying my role and learning to imitate my skills, but she'd never had to execute everything simultaneously under pressure while maintaining the gracious hostess persona she'd cultivated. The complexity of managing timing, temperature, and presentation for multiple dishes would test not just her technical abilities, but her capacity to handle stress while maintaining the illusion of effortless competence. The cameras were positioned, David was prepared to document everything, and Jessica had committed herself to a public demonstration of abilities she'd never actually developed independently. All that remained was to let her ambition exceed her genuine capabilities while ensuring that every moment of the resulting disaster was captured for posterity. The stage was set for Thanksgiving morning, when Jessica's performance of my identity would finally be exposed as the elaborate fraud it had always been. But until that moment arrived, I would continue playing my assigned role as helpful assistant. Watching Jessica prepare for a test, she had no idea she was about to fail spectacularly. The revelation that would expose Jessica's true motives came entirely by accident, proving that the universe sometimes provides exactly the evidence you need when you need it most. I was searching for my grandmother's molcajete, the volcanic stone mortar and pestle she'd brought from Mexico in 1952, when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind stacks of rarely used baking sheets in the bottom cabinet was a manila folder containing photocopies of every recipe card in my collection. Not just the cards themselves, but detailed notes about preparation techniques, ingredient sources, and the family stories associated with each dish. Jessica had been systematically documenting our entire culinary heritage with the thoroughness of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. She'd copied my grandmother's handwritten tamale instructions, complete with the Spanish notes in the margins that explained traditional timing methods. She'd photographed my mother's tres leches cake recipe that included the specific brand preferences that made our version distinctive from standard preparations. Most disturbing was the organization of her theft. Jessica had categorized everything by difficulty level, seasonality, and cultural significance, creating a comprehensive database of our family's food traditions. She'd even included notes about which dishes impressed guests most and which ones Michael specifically requested for special occasions. This wasn't casual interest in cooking or even ambitious meal planning. This was intellectual property theft, executed with professional precision. The folder contained something even more damning than copied recipes. Jessica had created a detailed timeline for gradually introducing what she called her interpretations of family dishes to Michael's extended family and social circle. She'd planned which events would showcase specific recipes, how she'd present herself as their creator, and which modifications she'd make to distinguish her versions from mine, while maintaining their essential appeal. Reading through her strategic notes felt like discovering a business plan for stealing my identity. Jessica had analyzed my cooking style with the cold calculation of a competitor studying market weaknesses. She'd identified which techniques she could replicate easily and which ones would require more practice to master convincingly. She'd even made notes about my storytelling style when sharing family food memories, planning to adapt those narratives to position herself as their proper inheritor rather than their temporary student. The most chilling document was a handwritten letter to herself, apparently written during one of her more reflective moments. In it, Jessica acknowledged that she was appropriating traditions that didn't belong to her, but she justified the theft by arguing that cultural heritage should belong to whoever could best preserve and present it to the world. She wrote that, "My approach to family recipes was too insular and traditional, limiting their potential impact to our immediate family rather than sharing them with a broader audience who could appreciate their value." She positioned herself as a cultural ambassador who could bridge the gap between authentic traditions and contemporary relevance. someone who understood both the historical significance of these recipes and their potential for modern adaptation. The letter revealed Jessica's grandiose vision of herself as a food influencer, who would build a personal brand around the cultural authenticity she was stealing from my family, while presenting herself as its natural spokesperson. Finding this folder felt like discovering evidence of a crime that was still in progress. Jessica wasn't just borrowing recipes or learning cooking techniques. She was executing a calculated plan to assume my cultural identity for personal and professional gain. Every moment of apparent respect for our traditions was actually reconnaissance for a systematic theft that would ultimately erase my contributions while positioning her as the rightful owner of knowledge she'd stolen. I photographed every page in that folder with my phone, creating a digital record of Jessica's premeditated cultural appropriation that would be impossible to deny or explain away. The timestamps on the documents proved that her systematic theft had begun within weeks of moving into my home, long before she'd demonstrated any genuine cooking ability or cultural understanding. Her early expressions of interest in family traditions weren't sincere curiosity, but calculated intelligence gathering for a theft she'd planned from the beginning. Returning the folder to its hiding place required extraordinary self-control. But I understood that confronting Jessica immediately would only prompt her to become more careful about concealing her true intentions. Instead, I needed to let her continue executing her plan while ensuring that every step was documented for later exposure. She was building a trap for herself with each recipe she stole and every lie she told about her cooking abilities. My job was to make sure that trap would close at exactly the right moment for maximum impact. That evening, Jessica emerged from the guest bedroom with unusual excitement, announcing that she'd finalized her Thanksgiving menu and was ready to begin serious preparation. She'd created what she called a comprehensive cooking schedule that would ensure everything was perfectly prepared and beautifully presented for her parents' visit. The confidence in her voice was remarkable, considering that she'd never successfully prepared more than 2 dishes simultaneously without constant guidance. She spread her handwritten menu across the dining room table like a general reviewing battle plans, explaining each dish's significance and the special techniques she planned to employ. Her descriptions were word-for-word repetitions of explanations I'd given her during our cooking sessions, but she delivered them with the authority of someone sharing original knowledge, rather than reciting borrowed information. Michael listened to Jessica's presentation with obvious pride, occasionally asking questions about specific preparations that she answered with increasing confidence. She described the 3-day timeline for turkey preparation, the careful timing required for multiple side dishes, and the traditional dessert techniques that would complete the meal. Everything she said was accurate, because she was essentially quoting my own instructions back to me. But she presented the information as evidence of her own planning and expertise. When Michael asked about the complexity of managing so many dishes simultaneously, Jessica assured him that she'd thought through every detail and felt confident in her abilities. She'd done extensive research, she explained, and had been practicing the more challenging techniques during her recent cooking sessions. What she didn't mention was that those practice sessions had been intensive tutorials, where I'd guided her through every step while she focused on memorizing techniques rather than understanding underlying principles. The gap between Jessica's confidence and her actual abilities was enormous, but she'd become skilled at concealing her limitations through careful preparation and strategic omissions. She could execute individual recipes successfully when following detailed guidance, but she'd never demonstrated the multitasking abilities or intuitive timing adjustments that real holiday cooking required. Her plan depended on maintaining the controlled conditions that had characterized our cooking sessions, but Thanksgiving preparation would involve multiple simultaneous processes that couldn't be managed through step-by-step instruction. Over the following days, Jessica's territorial behavior in my kitchen escalated to levels that would have been laughable if they weren't so brazen. She began rearranging my cooking tools according to what she called a more efficient organization system, moving frequently used items to locations that made sense to her rather than maintaining the arrangements I'd developed through decades of experience. When I reached for my favorite wooden spoon in its usual drawer, I'd find empty space because Jessica had relocated it to a different area that she considered more logical. She'd moved my spice containers to shelves that required a step stool to reach, explaining that alphabetical organization was more important than accessibility. She'd reorganized my pot and pan storage to create what she called better workflow, forcing me to search through unfamiliar configurations every time I needed basic equipment. These changes weren't just inconvenient, they were assertions of authority. Designed to make me feel like a guest in my own kitchen, Jessica was establishing physical dominance over my cooking space while preparing to demonstrate her mastery of my recipes, ensuring that I'd be operating at a disadvantage if I tried to participate in Thanksgiving preparation. She was creating conditions where she could claim expertise while I appeared confused and inefficient in my own domain. When I mentioned that the new organization system was difficult for me to navigate, Jessica responded with patronizing sympathy, suggesting that change was always challenging but ultimately beneficial. She offered to create labels and diagrams that would help me learn the new system, positioning herself as a patient teacher, helping an older woman adapt to improved methods. The condescension was breathtaking, but so was the strategic intelligence behind it. Jessica had studied my cooking routines carefully enough to disrupt them in ways that appeared helpful while actually undermining my effectiveness. She knew exactly which tools I reached for instinctively and which storage locations supported my natural workflow. By changing these arrangements, she could create situations where I'd appear clumsy or forgetful while she demonstrated superior organization and efficiency. More significantly, Jessica began scheduling her cooking practice sessions during times when she knew I had other commitments, effectively claiming exclusive access to my kitchen during my absence. She'd announced that she needed uninterrupted time to perfect challenging techniques, making it impossible for me to observe her actual abilities or provide guidance when she encountered difficulties. When I returned from volunteer work or grocery shopping, I'd find evidence of cooking disasters that Jessica had managed to clean up and conceal. Burnt pans soaking in the sink, ingredient containers left open with spills around them, and the lingering smell of something that had been overcooked or burned. She'd greet me cheerfully and describe her successful practice session while the physical evidence contradicted her claims of culinary triumph. These solo cooking attempts revealed the gap between Jessica's theoretical knowledge and her practical abilities. She could follow written instructions and reproduce techniques she'd observed, but she lacked the intuitive understanding that allowed experienced cooks to adjust timing, modify temperatures, and troubleshoot problems in real time. Her successes during our collaborative sessions had depended heavily on my guidance and intervention, but she'd convinced herself that her improved outcomes proved independent mastery. The kitchen cameras captured Jessica's solo practice sessions in devastating detail, documenting her struggles with timing, temperature control, and basic technique execution. She'd follow recipe instructions precisely, but miss visual and sensory cues that indicated when adjustments were needed. She'd panic when things didn't proceed exactly as written, lacking the experience to improvise solutions or recover from minor mistakes. Most revealing were her phone calls during these sessions, when Jessica would contact cooking helplines or text questions to friends who worked in restaurants. She'd describe problems with dishes that were supposedly based on her family recipes, asking for professional advice about techniques she claimed to have mastered. The conversations revealed someone who was desperately trying to execute preparations beyond her actual skill level while maintaining the fiction of expertise. Despite these struggles, Jessica's confidence continued growing as Thanksgiving approached. She'd successfully concealed most of her difficulties from Michael, presenting only her successes while attributing any problems to ingredient variations or equipment quirks. She'd begun discussing her cooking plans with such authority that even I sometimes wondered if she'd somehow developed genuine expertise through sheer determination and intensive practice. The final week before Thanksgiving brought Jessica's most audacious territorial claim yet. She announced that she'd invited her former roommate, Sarah, who worked as a freelance food photographer, to document the entire cooking process for what she called a cultural heritage preservation project. Sarah would create professional quality images and video content that Jessica planned to use for the food blog she intended to launch after the holidays. The photography session was ostensibly about preserving family traditions for future generations, but the real purpose was creating professional documentation of Jessica's performance of my expertise. She'd have high-quality images of herself preparing traditional dishes, video content showing her explaining cultural significance and preparation, techniques, and a comprehensive record of her mastery of our family's culinary heritage. Jessica planned to position herself as the star of this documentation while relegating me to the background as an honored elder whose knowledge was being preserved through her more contemporary interpretation. I would appear in some photos as a respectful nod to tradition, but the focus would be on Jessica's role as the bridge between old and new approaches to cultural preservation. When Jessica called Sarah to discuss the photography plans, I listened from the next room as she described herself as the primary subject of the documentation. She explained that she'd been learning traditional family recipes and wanted to create a professional record of her developing expertise. She positioned the photo session as documenting her journey of cultural appreciation, rather than acknowledging that she was appropriating knowledge from its original source. Sarah responded enthusiastically to Jessica's proposal, praising her commitment to preserving cultural heritage and suggesting additional content ideas that would enhance the storytelling impact of the documentation. They discussed lighting setups, styling approaches, and narrative frameworks that would present Jessica's cooking process as an inspiring story of cultural connection and culinary mastery. The conversation revealed Jessica's long-term strategy with perfect clarity. She wasn't just stealing my recipes for personal use or even for impressing family members. She was building a public platform based on appropriated cultural knowledge, planning to leverage my family's traditions for professional credibility and social media influence. The Thanksgiving documentation would serve as her portfolio for establishing herself as a cultural food authority. Hearing Jessica plan this exploitation of my heritage with such casual entitlement finally pushed me beyond strategic patience into active resistance. She was preparing to profit professionally from knowledge she'd stolen while positioning herself as its rightful owner, and me as a supporting character in my own family's cultural story. The audacity was so complete that it transcended mere theft and approached the level of identity erasure. That night, I called my son David and explained that I needed his help with a project that was more important than simple family documentation. Without revealing the full scope of Jessica's deception, I asked him to bring professional video equipment and plan to record everything that happened during Thanksgiving preparation from multiple angles with continuous coverage. David agreed, immediately, thinking he was helping document family traditions for posterity, rather than gathering evidence of cultural theft. His enthusiasm for the project provided perfect cover for the comprehensive surveillance I needed to expose Jessica's fraud at exactly the right moment for maximum impact. As Thanksgiving week arrived, all the pieces were finally in position. Jessica had committed herself to a public demonstration of abilities she'd never actually developed independently. She'd invited an audience specifically to witness her mastery of traditions she'd stolen, and she'd arranged for professional documentation of her performance. The cameras would capture everything, David would provide independent verification, and Jessica's own ambition would supply the rope for her public hanging. The stage was set for the most satisfying exposure of fraud I'd ever witnessed, and I had front row seats to watch Jessica's carefully constructed persona collapse under the weight of her own impossible promises. Thanksgiving morning arrived, with the crisp desert air that made November in Arizona feel like a gift from heaven. The sun painted my kitchen golden as I stood by the window, watching Jessica emerge from the guest bedroom at 5:30 in the morning with the determined expression of someone preparing for battle. She wore a pristine apron she'd purchased specifically for this occasion, adorned with decorative Day of the Dead skulls that she probably thought demonstrated her appreciation for Mexican culture, but actually revealed how superficially she understood the traditions she was attempting to appropriate. David had arrived the night before with enough professional video equipment to film a documentary, explaining to Jessica that he wanted to create a comprehensive family archive that would preserve our holiday traditions for future generations. She'd welcomed his presence enthusiastically, viewing his cameras as additional documentation of her culinary mastery, rather than the surveillance equipment they actually represented. She posed for several test shots, practicing the confident smile she planned to wear while explaining the cultural significance of dishes she'd learned to prepare just weeks earlier. Jessica's parents, Tom and Carol, were scheduled to arrive at noon, giving her 6 hours to complete preparations that typically required me 3 full days of careful planning and execution. She'd dismissed my gentle suggestions about the complexity of her timeline, insisting that her organization skills and advanced preparation would compensate for any challenges that arose during the cooking process. Her confidence was absolute and completely disconnected from reality. But I maintained my supportive facade while internally preparing for the spectacular failure that was about to unfold. The first sign of trouble appeared within 30 minutes of Jessica's cooking marathon beginning. She'd planned to start with the turkey, confident that she'd mastered the brining and seasoning process after watching me prepare birds for previous family gatherings. But when she opened the refrigerator to retrieve the 20-pound bird she'd been thawing for 2 days, she discovered that her thawing timeline had been completely inadequate. The turkey was still partially frozen, with ice crystals throughout the cavity and solid sections in the breast meat that would require hours of careful defrosting before cooking could begin. I watched from the breakfast nook as Jessica stared at the frozen turkey with growing panic, her confident timeline already shattered before the real cooking had even started. She grabbed her phone and began frantically searching for solutions to accelerate thawing, finding conflicting advice that ranged from cold water baths to microwave defrosting that would compromise the meat's texture and safety. David's cameras captured every moment of her mounting anxiety as she realized that her most important dish might not be ready in time for her parents' arrival. When Jessica asked for my advice about the turkey situation, I offered gentle guidance while secretly documenting her lack of fundamental knowledge about food safety and preparation timing. I explained the cold water bath method that could safely accelerate thawing, but I also mentioned that the timeline would still be extremely tight, and that starting the cooking process with a partially frozen bird would result in uneven cooking and potentially dangerous undercooked sections. Jessica absorbed this information with visible distress, understanding for the first time that her ambitious schedule was based on theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience. She'd memorized my instructions for preparing properly, thawed birds, but she'd never learned the foundational principles that would help her adapt to unexpected complications. Her stolen expertise was revealed as incomplete and superficial when tested by real-world challenges that required genuine understanding rather than memorized procedures. As Jessica struggled with the turkey crisis, her carefully planned cooking schedule began collapsing like dominoes. She'd allocated specific time slots for each dish based on optimal conditions, but the turkey delay created cascading problems that affected every other preparation. The side dishes that depended on oven space would have to be delayed or prepared, using alternative methods she hadn't researched. The timing for appetizers and desserts would need complete reorganization to accommodate the extended turkey preparation time. I offered to help salvage the situation by taking responsibility for some of the less complex dishes, but Jessica declined with the desperate determination of someone who understood that accepting assistance would expose her incompetence to David's cameras and undermine her planned performance for her parents. She insisted that she could manage everything independently, despite clear evidence that her timeline was already impossibly compromised. The next disaster struck when Jessica attempted to prepare my grandmother's mole sauce, a complex preparation that required toasting and grinding multiple varieties of chilies, balancing more than 20 different ingredients, and achieving the perfect consistency through careful technique and timing. She'd observed me make this sauce twice and had taken detailed notes about each step, but she'd never attempted the full preparation independently. Within minutes, Jessica had burned the first batch of toasted chilies by leaving them unattended. while trying to manage the turkey thawing process. The acrid smoke filled my kitchen as she frantically opened windows and activated the exhaust fan, trying to clear the air before the smell could alert David to her mounting failures. She attempted to salvage the burned chilies by removing the most damaged pieces, but the bitter taste had already contaminated the entire batch. Her second attempt at the mole proceeded more carefully, but Jessica's inexperience showed in dozens of small mistakes that accumulated into a sauce that bore little resemblance to my grandmother's recipe. She misjudged the consistency of the chili paste, added ingredients in the wrong sequence, and failed to achieve the complex flavor balance that required intuitive adjustments based on taste rather than strict adherence to written measurements. David's cameras documented every mistake and moment of panic, creating a comprehensive record of Jessica's actual cooking abilities when stripped of my guidance and support. Her confident explanations of traditional techniques dissolved into confused fumbling as she encountered problems she'd never learned to solve independently. The gap between her claimed expertise and her demonstrated skills became undeniable as the morning progressed. By 9 o'clock, Jessica's kitchen looked like a war zone. Dirty dishes overflowed from the sink onto every available counter surface. Ingredient containers stood open with spills creating sticky messes across my granite countertops. And the smell of burned food lingered despite her efforts to mask it with scented candles. She'd completed only a fraction of her planned preparations, and several of her attempted dishes were already ruined beyond salvage. More significantly, Jessica's composed demeanor had cracked under pressure, revealing the anxiety and incompetence she'd been concealing behind her confident facade. She snapped at David when his cameras captured her mistakes, demanding that he delete footage that showed her struggles rather than her successes. Her mask of gracious hostess and expert cook was slipping as the gap between her promises and her abilities became impossible to maintain. When Jessica's parents called to confirm their arrival time, she answered with forced cheerfulness while surveying the chaos surrounding her. She assured them that everything was proceeding beautifully, and that she was excited to share the authentic cultural experience she'd been preparing. The disconnect between her words and her reality was so complete that even David, who had been focused on technical aspects of filming, began noticing the tension in her voice and the panic in her eyes. At 10:30, with less than 90 minutes remaining before her parents' arrival, Jessica finally accepted that she couldn't complete her planned menu independently. But instead of asking for my assistance directly, she attempted to manipulate me into taking over the cooking while allowing her to maintain the fiction of leadership. She began expressing concern about my desire to contribute to the family celebration, suggesting that I might feel excluded if she handled everything herself. Jessica's attempted manipulation was transparent and insulting, but it provided the perfect opportunity for me to execute the final phase of my plan. I agreed to help with the cooking, but I insisted that David continue documenting everything for the family archive. I wanted comprehensive footage of exactly who was doing what in the kitchen, ensuring that the truth about our collaborative efforts would be preserved for later review. As I took control of the salvage operation, my decades of experience in managing kitchen crises became immediately apparent. I quickly assessed which of Jessica's attempted dishes could be rescued and which needed to be started fresh with simplified approaches that could be completed in the available time. I reorganized the cooking workflow to maximize efficiency, delegated appropriate tasks to Jessica that matched her actual abilities, and began the careful orchestration required to produce a respectable meal from the chaos she'd created. David's cameras captured the dramatic shift in kitchen dynamics as I transformed from background observer to active leader, demonstrating the expertise that Jessica had been claiming as her own. My confident handling of timing, temperature, and technique stood in stark contrast to Jessica's earlier fumbling, making it obvious to any observer who possessed genuine cooking knowledge and who was performing borrowed skills. While I worked to salvage the Thanksgiving meal, Jessica attempted to maintain her role as primary chef by providing running commentary about the dishes being prepared and their cultural significance. But her explanations became increasingly hollow as it became clear that she was describing processes she was watching me execute rather than techniques she was personally demonstrating. She'd positioned herself as the star of her own cooking show, but the actual expertise was being provided by someone else entirely. When Tom and Carol arrived promptly at noon, they entered a kitchen where I was putting finishing touches on a spread of traditional dishes while Jessica stood nearby offering explanations and accepting compliments. The visual tableau supported Jessica's narrative of culinary mastery, but David's cameras had documented the reality of who had actually done the work during the previous 6 hours of intense preparation. Jessica's parents were genuinely impressed with the meal and the cultural education she provided about each dish's significance and preparation. Tom praised her dedication to learning his daughter-in-law's family traditions, while Carol marveled at the complexity of the flavors and the obvious skill required to execute such an elaborate menu. Their praise fed Jessica's ego and reinforced her belief that her performance had been successful. Throughout the meal, Jessica regaled her parents with detailed stories about her cooking process, describing challenges she'd overcome and techniques she'd mastered while preparing each dish. She spoke confidently about the cultural research she'd conducted and the traditional methods she'd learned to honor authentic preparation approaches. Every word she said was technically accurate because she was repeating information I'd shared with her, but she presented it as evidence of her own knowledge and experience. Michael listened to Jessica's presentation with obvious pride, occasionally adding comments about her dedication to learning family traditions and her natural talent for complex cooking techniques. He'd become so accustomed to Jessica's gradual assumption of my role that he no longer questioned the source of her expertise or wondered about the dramatic improvement in her abilities over such a short time period. The meal itself was a success, thanks to my intervention and salvage efforts, but Jessica received complete credit for its execution while I remained in the background as a helpful assistant. Her parents left believing they'd witnessed their daughter's mastery of authentic cultural traditions, and Michael's pride in his wife's domestic abilities reached new heights. From external appearances, Jessica's gamble had paid off spectacularly, but David had captured everything on multiple cameras from multiple angles, creating an unedited record of the actual preparation process that told a completely different story. When the guests departed and the dishes were cleaned, he sat down with his laptop to begin reviewing the footage for editing purposes, planning to create a heartwarming family video that celebrated our holiday traditions. What he discovered instead was comprehensive documentation of fraud, manipulation, and cultural appropriation that revealed Jessica's claims to be elaborate fiction. The footage showed me handling the vast majority of actual cooking while Jessica provided commentary and posed for photos. It documented her panic when faced with real challenges, her inability to execute techniques she claimed to have mastered, and her systematic appropriation of credit for work she hadn't performed. David watched the footage with growing amazement and anger, understanding for the first time the scope of Jessica's deception and the injustice I'd been enduring for months. He saw my patient guidance being transformed into Jessica's confident expertise, my family's cultural traditions being repackaged as her personal achievements, and my role as family matriarch being systematically erased by someone who contributed performance rather than substance. The next morning, David approached me with the edited footage and a proposal that would expose Jessica's fraud while vindicating my expertise and cultural ownership. He'd created a time-lapse compilation that showed the reality of Thanksgiving preparation, compressed into 10 minutes of undeniable evidence that revealed who had actually done the work versus who had claimed credit for the results. When Michael arrived for leftover turkey sandwiches, David suggested viewing the family video he'd created to commemorate our holiday celebration. He set up his laptop in the living room and called everyone together for what he described as a special presentation that captured the authentic spirit of our cultural traditions and family bonds. Jessica settled onto the couch with confidence, expecting to see documentation of her culinary triumph and cultural appreciation. Michael sat beside her, ready to relive his wife's impressive demonstration of domestic skills. I positioned myself where I could observe their reactions as the truth was finally revealed through David's careful editing and comprehensive documentation. The video began with Jessica's confident emergence from the guest bedroom and her optimistic assessment of the cooking timeline that lay ahead. But as the time-lapse accelerated through the morning's events, the reality of what had transpired became undeniably clear. Jessica appeared in scattered moments of confused fumbling, while I dominated the screen with confident, efficient preparation of dish after dish. The visual evidence was devastating and irrefutable. Jessica's claims of culinary mastery were exposed as elaborate performance art, supported by my invisible labor and expertise. Her cultural appreciation was revealed as systematic appropriation of traditions she'd stolen rather than earned. Her confidence during the meal presentation stood in stark contrast to her panic and incompetence during actual preparation. Michael watched the footage with growing shock and embarrassment, understanding for the first time how completely he'd been deceived by Jessica's manipulation and performance. He saw his wife's fraud documented in minute detail, but he also saw his own failure to recognize my contributions or question Jessica's sudden expertise in traditions that had taken me decades to master. Jessica attempted damage control by claiming that the video was edited misleadingly and that her supervisory role wasn't captured effectively by the cameras. She insisted that her planning and guidance had been crucial to the meal's success, even if she hadn't personally handled every technical aspect of the preparation. But the footage was too comprehensive and detailed to support her revisionist explanations. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Michael demanded explanations that Jessica couldn't provide without admitting to systematic fraud and cultural appropriation. Her parents were called and informed about the deception their daughter had perpetrated using their praise and approval as validation. The carefully constructed fiction of Jessica's domestic expertise collapsed completely under the weight of documented evidence. Within a week, Jessica had moved out of my home permanently, taking only her personal belongings and leaving behind the recipes she'd stolen and the cultural identity she'd attempted to appropriate. She made no apologies and offered no acknowledgement of the damage she'd caused, maintaining to the end that she'd done nothing wrong by learning and practicing family traditions she'd been welcomed to share. Michael spent the following months rebuilding his relationship with me and coming to terms with how thoroughly he'd been manipulated by someone he'd trusted completely. He began learning to cook traditional dishes directly from me, asking questions about family history and cultural significance that demonstrated genuine respect rather than extractive appropriation. The time-lapse video David created became a family treasure that documented not just the technical aspects of traditional cooking, but the generational transmission of cultural knowledge that gave these traditions their true meaning. It served as proof that expertise requires more than memorized techniques, and that cultural authenticity cannot be stolen or performed convincingly by outsiders seeking to profit from traditions they haven't earned through lived experience. David shared the video on social media with Jessica's permission tags removed, where it went viral as a powerful example of cultural appreciation versus appropriation. The response from viewers was overwhelmingly supportive, with many sharing their own stories of having family traditions stolen or misrepresented by people who claimed expertise they hadn't developed authentically. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Jessica's attempted theft had actually strengthened my connection to my cultural heritage and my role as its guardian. Her fraud had forced me to articulate and demonstrate the depth of knowledge that separated genuine expertise from borrowed performance. Her failure had vindicated not just my cooking abilities, but the value of the traditions she'd tried to steal. This Thanksgiving, my kitchen belongs to me again completely. My recipes remain in their proper place, my techniques are credited to their actual source, and my cultural identity is secure from appropriation. Jessica learned that some things cannot be stolen successfully, no matter how carefully planned or confidently executed. Authenticity has roots too deep for surface theft to damage permanently. The lesson for anyone facing similar appropriation is simple but powerful. Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember that truth has a way of revealing itself when the pressure becomes too great for fiction to maintain. Sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing fraudsters to expose themselves through their own impossible promises and inevitable failures. The aftermath of David's video revelation created a seismic shift that rippled through every aspect of our family dynamics and Jessica's carefully constructed social persona. Within hours of viewing the footage, Michael's shock transformed into a deep, burning anger that I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, confronting playground bullies who had targeted his younger brothers. The realization that he'd been systematically manipulated and used as a weapon against his own mother created a fury that was both protective and self-directed, as he grappled with his own role in enabling Jessica's elaborate deception. Jessica's initial response to being exposed was not shame or remorse, but a calculated attempt to minimize the damage through strategic deflection and victim positioning. She claimed that the video editing had distorted the reality of her contributions, arguing that her supervisory role and advanced planning weren't captured effectively by cameras focused on physical cooking actions. She insisted that her cultural research and menu organization constituted the real expertise, while the actual cooking was merely execution of her thoughtful preparation and guidance. When this explanation failed to satisfy anyone who had watched the comprehensive footage, Jessica shifted to attacking the ethics of surveillance, claiming that she'd been secretly recorded without consent in what she had believed was a supportive family environment. She positioned herself as the victim of a vindictive mother-in-law who had manipulated her own son into betraying his wife's trust through deceptive documentation of private moments. The manipulation continued as Jessica attempted to reframe the entire situation as a cultural misunderstanding rather than deliberate fraud. She claimed that her approach to learning family traditions had been misinterpreted due to generational differences in how cultural knowledge was shared and preserved. She suggested that her documentation and adaptation of recipes represented legitimate cultural exchange rather than appropriation, positioning any criticism as resistance to natural evolution of traditional practices. But David's video was too comprehensive and damning to be explained away through semantic manipulation or victimhood claims. The footage showed not just who had done the physical cooking, but captured Jessica's moments of panic when faced with techniques she'd claimed to master, her frantic phone searches for basic cooking information, and her desperate attempts to conceal failures that revealed her fundamental incompetence. More damaging were the audio segments where Jessica could be heard making condescending comments about my outdated methods, while simultaneously copying those same techniques when she thought no one was listening. The cameras had captured her, practicing explanations she planned to give about traditional cooking approaches, rehearsing the cultural narratives she intended to present as evidence of her deep appreciation for our family heritage. Michael's confrontation with Jessica that evening was the most difficult conversation I'd witnessed in decades of family crises. He demanded answers to questions that had no satisfactory explanations, asking how she could have systematically deceived him about abilities she didn't possess, while accepting praise for expertise she'd stolen from his mother. He wanted to understand when she'd decided to appropriate our family's cultural identity, and whether any aspect of her domestic enthusiasm had been genuine rather than calculated performance. Jessica's responses revealed the depth of her self-justification and her inability to acknowledge the harm she'd caused through her systematic deception. She continued insisting that her approach had been collaborative rather than appropriative, claiming that she'd been working to preserve and modernize traditions that might otherwise be lost to changing times. She positioned her documentation and adaptation efforts as cultural stewardship rather than theft, suggesting that her youth and contemporary perspective made her better suited to sharing these traditions with broader audiences. When Michael pressed her about the hidden folder containing copied recipes and strategic plans for appropriating family traditions, Jessica claimed that her organization and forward thinking demonstrated commitment rather than calculation. She argued that her systematic approach to learning proved her serious dedication to honoring our heritage, while her planning for future applications showed her desire to ensure these traditions would continue rather than fade away with older generations. The conversation revealed Jessica's fundamental inability to distinguish between genuine cultural appreciation and exploitative appropriation. She couldn't understand why learning family recipes and sharing them with others was problematic, viewing her theft as legitimate cultural exchange rather than unauthorized appropriation of intellectual and cultural property that belonged to specific people with specific histories. More disturbing was Jessica's complete lack of empathy for the impact her deception had created. She showed no understanding of how her systematic erasure of my contributions had affected my relationship with my son or my standing within my own family. She couldn't grasp why accepting credit for work she hadn't performed was harmful, viewing the praise she'd received as validation of her appreciation rather than theft of recognition that belonged to someone else. The depth of Jessica's narcissism became clear as the conversation continued, revealing someone who genuinely believed that her intentions justified any harm she'd caused through her methods. She'd convinced herself that her goals of cultural preservation and sharing were so noble that the means she'd used to achieve them were automatically ethical, regardless of whom she'd deceived or displaced in the process. Michael's disillusionment was profound and painful to witness. He'd believed himself married to someone who shared his values and respected his family, only to discover that his wife had been executing a calculated plan to steal his mother's identity while positioning herself as a superior replacement. The woman he'd fallen in love with had been performing a role designed to manipulate him into supporting her appropriation of everything meaningful about his cultural heritage. The following days brought a cascade of revelations as Michael began examining other aspects of their relationship with new skepticism and awareness. He discovered that Jessica's apparent interest in his childhood stories had been intelligence gathering for her cultural appropriation project, rather than genuine curiosity about his experiences. Her enthusiasm for family photographs and traditions had been research for her performance rather than authentic connection to his heritage. Even Jessica's apparent devotion to their marriage was revealed as strategic positioning rather than genuine emotion. Her constant touching, her careful attention to his preferences, and her apparent eagerness to please had all been calculated behaviors designed to maintain his support while she executed her systematic theft of his family's cultural identity. Michael found evidence of Jessica's long-term planning in her computer files, including documents that outlined her strategy for gradually replacing me as the family's cultural authority, while positioning herself as the natural inheritor of traditions she'd never legitimately earned. She'd planned specific milestones for her takeover, including hosting major holidays, teaching grandchildren family recipes, and eventually becoming the primary source of cultural knowledge for future generations. The scope of Jessica's ambition was breathtaking in its audacity and chilling in its calculation. She hadn't simply wanted to learn family recipes or participate in cultural traditions. She'd wanted to own them completely, erasing my contributions, while establishing herself as their authentic source and rightful keeper. Her plan required not just stealing knowledge, but systematically undermining my credibility and relevance until she could claim total authority over traditions that had taken me decades to master. When Michael shared these discoveries with me, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. The evidence proved that my instincts about Jessica's true nature had been accurate from the beginning, but it also revealed how completely my son had been manipulated by someone he'd trusted with his heart and his future. His pain at discovering the depth of Jessica's deception was almost harder to witness than the original theft had been to endure. Jessica's parents, Tom and Carol, were contacted and informed about the documented evidence of their daughter's systematic fraud and cultural appropriation. Their initial response was defensive disbelief, as they struggled to reconcile the evidence with their perception of Jessica as a thoughtful young woman who appreciated cultural diversity and traditional values. When shown David's comprehensive video documentation, Tom and Carol were forced to confront the reality of their daughter's calculated deception. They watched footage of Jessica panicking when faced with cooking challenges she'd claimed to master, saw her appropriating credit for work she hadn't performed, and heard her practicing explanations for cultural knowledge she'd stolen rather than earned through legitimate learning. The conversation with Jessica's parents was awkward and painful, as they grappled with their daughter's behavior while attempting to process their own unwitting participation in validating her fraud. They'd praised Jessica's cooking abilities and cultural appreciation based on deliberately misleading presentations, making them inadvertent accessories to her systematic theft of credit and recognition. Tom expressed particular distress at having complimented Jessica's mastery of traditional techniques, while the actual expert who'd taught her everything stood silently in the background. He realized that his praise had been systematically misdirected through Jessica's manipulation, making him an unwitting participant in erasing my contributions while elevating her stolen expertise. Carol struggled with the realization that her daughter's apparent cultural sensitivity and domestic skills had been elaborate performance art rather than genuine development of character and abilities. She'd been proud of Jessica's evolution into a woman who honored family traditions and contributed meaningfully to household management, only to discover that these admirable qualities had been carefully constructed facades hiding systematic appropriation and fraud. Jessica's parents demanded explanations from their daughter that she couldn't provide without admitting to deliberate deception and calculated harm. When confronted with the comprehensive evidence of her fraud, Jessica continued her pattern of deflection and justification, claiming that her parents' disappointment stemmed from their failure to understand contemporary approaches to cultural exchange and tradition preservation. The family meeting that followed Jessica's exposure was one of the most emotionally charged gatherings our family had ever experienced. Michael insisted that Jessica acknowledge her fraud and apologize for the systematic harm she'd caused. But she remained defiant and unrepentant, continuing to position herself as a misunderstood cultural ambassador rather than a calculated thief. Jessica's refusal to accept responsibility for her actions or acknowledge the harm she'd caused made reconciliation impossible. She couldn't understand why anyone was upset about her efforts to learn and share family traditions, viewing the criticism as evidence of cultural gatekeeping rather than legitimate protection of intellectual and cultural property rights. The divorce proceedings that followed were swift and decisive, as Michael's trust in Jessica had been completely destroyed by the evidence of her systematic deception. There was no possibility of rebuilding a relationship founded on fraud, particularly when Jessica continued denying wrongdoing and justifying her appropriation as cultural appreciation rather than theft. Jessica's departure from our home was surprisingly drama-free, as she seemed eager to escape what she viewed as an unreasonable family situation rather than acknowledge her role in creating the crisis. She packed her belongings efficiently and left without ceremony, maintaining her position as the wronged party, even as she abandoned the life she'd built through systematic deception. The immediate aftermath of Jessica's departure created a strange emptiness in our home, not because we missed her presence, but because the constant tension and vigilance her manipulation had required left a void that took time to fill with healthier family dynamics. We had to relearn how to interact without the underlying current of deception and appropriation that had characterized every gathering for months. Michael's recovery from Jessica's betrayal was gradual and sometimes painful, as he processed not just the specific fraud she'd committed, but the broader implications of having been so thoroughly manipulated by someone he'd planned to spend his life with. He questioned his judgment, his ability to recognize deception, and his failure to protect his mother from systematic abuse that had occurred under his own roof. The healing process involved Michael taking active responsibility for learning family traditions directly from me, approaching the cultural education with genuine respect and humble acknowledgement of his previous inattention to the source of knowledge he'd taken for granted. He asked thoughtful questions about the history behind specific recipes, the regional variations that had influenced our family's approaches, and the economic and social factors that had shaped traditional cooking methods. These conversations were precious to me representing the first time Michael had engaged with our cultural heritage as an adult, seeking to understand and preserve traditions rather than simply consuming the results of my expertise. His questions demonstrated genuine curiosity about the stories behind our food, the challenges my grandmother had faced in adapting Mexican cooking to American ingredients, and the ways family recipes had evolved through generations of practical necessity and creative adaptation. Michael's newfound appreciation for the complexity and depth of traditional cooking knowledge made him a fierce protector of family recipes and cultural practices. He understood now that these traditions represented more than entertainment or nostalgia, but constituted living links to ancestors who had preserved important knowledge through deliberate practice and careful transmission to younger generations. David's role in exposing Jessica's fraud had positioned him as the family's unofficial archivist and protector of cultural documentation. He continued developing his video projects, but with greater awareness of the importance of accurate attribution and respectful representation of cultural knowledge. His footage had saved our family from ongoing manipulation, but it had also taught him about the responsibility that came with documenting and sharing traditional practices. The viral success of David's edited video brought unexpected attention to our family's story, as viewers responded powerfully to the clear demonstration of cultural appropriation being exposed through comprehensive documentation. The response included thousands of comments from people sharing their own experiences with recipe theft, cultural appropriation, and systematic erasure of contributions by family members or colleagues. Many viewers expressed appreciation for seeing justice served in a situation where fraud had been definitively proven rather than remaining a matter of competing claims and interpretations. The visual evidence provided by David's cameras had created an irrefutable record that demonstrated not just what had happened, but the systematic nature of Jessica's deception and the gap between her claims and her actual abilities. The attention brought opportunities for me to share knowledge about traditional cooking methods and cultural preservation in more formal settings, including interviews with food historians and invitations to demonstrate techniques at cultural centers and culinary schools. These platforms allowed me to reclaim my expertise publicly while educating others about the difference between genuine cultural exchange and exploitative appropriation. More importantly, the experience had strengthened my relationship with both my sons and deepened their appreciation for traditions they'd previously taken for granted. Michael and David both began participating more actively in holiday preparations, asking to learn specific techniques and taking responsibility for maintaining family recipes, rather than simply enjoying the results of my efforts. The long-term impact of Jessica's attempted theft was ultimately positive, as it forced all of us to articulate and defend the value of authentic cultural knowledge, while strengthening our commitment to preserving traditions through legitimate transmission, rather than allowing them to be appropriated by outsiders seeking to profit from stolen expertise. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Jessica's fraud had taught me important lessons about protecting cultural heritage. In an era when social media and food blogs made it easy for people to claim expertise they hadn't earned through legitimate learning and practice. Her systematic appropriation had been more sophisticated than simple recipe theft, representing a comprehensive attempt to assume cultural identity through performance rather than authentic connection. The resolution of our family crisis provided a template for recognizing and responding to cultural appropriation in domestic settings, where theft often occurred gradually through relationships that provided access to traditional knowledge. Jessica's methods could be replicated by anyone seeking to appropriate cultural expertise for personal gain, making it important to document and share strategies for protecting authentic traditions from exploitation. This Thanksgiving, our table will be filled with dishes prepared by hands that earned the right to make them, shared by people who understand their cultural significance beyond mere consumption. The recipes remain where they belong, the techniques are credited to their proper sources, and the traditions continue through legitimate transmission rather than fraudulent appropriation. The empty chair where Jessica once sat serves as a reminder that some forms of theft cannot be tolerated. No matter how cleverly disguised as appreciation, or how skillfully performed for unsuspecting audiences. Authenticity has deep roots that surface theft cannot permanently disturb, and truth has a way of revealing itself when pressure makes deception too difficult to maintain. The ripple effects of Jessica's exposure extended far beyond our immediate family, creating waves of consequences that touched every aspect of her social and professional life in ways she had never anticipated when planning her elaborate cultural theft. Within days of David's video gaining traction on social media, Jessica's carefully constructed image as a sophisticated home cook and cultural ambassador began crumbling as friends, colleagues, and acquaintances realized they had witnessed and praised fraudulent performances rather than genuine expertise. Her former book club members reached out to me directly, expressing embarrassment about the compliments they had lavished on Jessica's cooking during gatherings at my home. Several women mentioned feeling manipulated and deceived, particularly those who had asked Jessica for cooking advice or recipe recommendations based on what they believed was her developing expertise. They realized they had been praising stolen knowledge, while the actual source of that expertise remained invisible in the background, serving refreshments and cleaning up messes without receiving any recognition. The social media response to our story revealed how widespread the problem of cultural appropriation had become in domestic settings, as hundreds of people shared similar experiences of having family recipes stolen, cultural traditions misrepresented, or expertise appropriated by individuals seeking to enhance their own social status. The comments section became a support group for people who had experienced various forms of culinary theft, but had never seen their situations validated or their frustrations acknowledged by others who understood the unique pain of watching personal heritage being commodified by outsiders. Many viewers specifically related to the generational aspect of our conflict, sharing stories about younger family members or friends who had appropriated older relatives' cooking knowledge while positioning themselves as more contemporary and relevant interpreters of traditional methods. The pattern of respectful learning transforming into exploitative theft seemed to be disturbingly common, particularly in families where cultural knowledge was abundant but not formally protected through written documentation or legal recognition. Professional chefs and food industry workers also responded to our story, expressing frustration about encountering similar appropriation in commercial settings, where individuals claimed expertise in ethnic cuisines they had learned through brief exposure rather than cultural inheritance or formal training. Several restaurant owners mentioned discovering employees who exaggerated their knowledge of traditional cooking methods to gain positions they were not qualified to hold, creating situations where authentic cultural food was being misrepresented to paying customers. The discussion expanded to include broader conversations about intellectual property rights in culinary contexts, where traditional recipes and techniques had been passed down through generations without formal copyright protection, but remained valuable cultural assets that deserved protection from unauthorized commercial exploitation. Legal experts weighed in on the complexities of protecting traditional knowledge while still allowing for legitimate cultural exchange and recipe evolution. Food historians contributed perspectives about the importance of accurate attribution and cultural context when sharing traditional recipes, emphasizing that the stories behind dishes were often as valuable as the preparation methods themselves. They highlighted how Jessica's appropriation represented not just theft of techniques, but erasure of the historical and cultural narratives that gave those techniques meaning and significance within their original communities. The academic response included discussions about cultural appropriation in domestic settings being different from commercial exploitation, but equally harmful to individuals and families whose heritage was being stolen for personal gain. Anthropologists and sociologists analyzed the power dynamics that enabled Jessica's systematic theft, noting how traditional gender roles and family hierarchies had created conditions where her appropriation could proceed unchallenged for months while causing ongoing harm to its victim. Jessica's former employer, a marketing firm where she had worked as a consultant, contacted our family after seeing the viral video and recognizing their former employee's face. They revealed that Jessica had been terminated several months earlier, for claiming credit for client strategies developed by other team members, a pattern of behavior that perfectly aligned with her systematic appropriation of my family's cultural knowledge. Her professional misconduct had followed the same template of strategic theft and credit appropriation that she had applied to our cooking traditions. The revelation about Jessica's workplace behavior confirmed that her fraud was not an isolated incident triggered by unique circumstances in our family, but represented a consistent pattern of taking credit for other people's work while positioning herself as more capable and innovative than her actual abilities warranted. Her systematic approach to appropriation had apparently been refined through multiple contexts, where she had successfully deceived colleagues and supervisors about her genuine contributions to collaborative efforts. Her former co-workers shared stories about Jessica's habit of documenting other people's ideas and presenting them as her own innovations, using the same careful note-taking and strategic planning that she had applied to stealing my recipes and cultural knowledge. They described her ability to charm supervisors while undermining colleagues, positioning herself as indispensable while making others appear incompetent or outdated in their approaches to shared projects. The professional pattern revealed Jessica's appropriation of my family's traditions as part of a broader lifestyle strategy, where she systematically stole expertise from various sources to construct a public persona that would support her social and economic ambitions. Her theft of our cultural heritage had been intended as the foundation for a food blog and social media presence that would have generated income and influence based entirely on knowledge she had no right to claim or commercialize. Investigation into Jessica's social media activity revealed that she had already begun building an online platform based on stolen family recipes, posting photographs of dishes I had taught her to make while describing them as her own creations, inspired by her appreciation for diverse cultural traditions. Her captions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of food styling and storytelling techniques, suggesting that her appropriation project had been planned as a professional venture rather than personal hobby. The food blog she had been developing included detailed posts about traditional cooking methods, complete with historical context and cultural significance that she had extracted from our conversations and presented as her own research and understanding. She had written eloquently about the importance of preserving cultural heritage while systematically stealing that heritage from its rightful owners, demonstrating a level of cognitive dissonance that was both remarkable and disturbing. Her planned monetization strategy included partnerships with kitchenware companies, cookbook publishing deals, and sponsored content relationships that would have generated substantial income from expertise she had appropriated without permission or acknowledgement. The scope of her commercial ambitions revealed the full extent of the harm she had intended to cause, as she planned to profit indefinitely from cultural knowledge that belonged to our family's history, rather than her personal achievements. When confronted with evidence of her professional pattern of theft and fraud, Jessica's response remained consistent with her refusal to accept responsibility for any wrongdoing. She claimed that all professional environments involved collaboration and shared credit, suggesting that her appropriation of colleagues' work was standard practice rather than unethical behavior. She positioned herself as someone who had been unfairly targeted for behaviors that were common and acceptable in competitive work environments. Her defense of the cultural appropriation followed similar logic, as she continued insisting that learning and sharing traditional recipes constituted legitimate cultural exchange rather than theft. She argued that knowledge should be freely shared rather than hoarded by individuals who happened to inherit it through family connections, positioning her appropriation as democratic access to information rather than unauthorized exploitation of others' intellectual property. The legal consultation that followed Jessica's exposure revealed limited options for formal prosecution, as cultural knowledge and family recipes fell into gray areas where intellectual property law provided minimal protection for traditional knowledge that had not been formally copyrighted or trademarked. However, the comprehensive documentation we had gathered would support civil action if Jessica attempted to profit commercially from stolen recipes or claimed expertise she had fraudulently appropriated. More importantly, The public exposure of Jessica's fraud had effectively ended her ability to monetize stolen cultural knowledge, as any future attempts to build a food platform would be immediately recognized and challenged by the thousands of people who had witnessed her deception being documented and exposed. Her reputation in food and social media circles had been permanently damaged by the viral documentation of her systematic theft and fraud. The therapeutic value of public vindication extended beyond simple satisfaction at seeing justice served, as the overwhelming support from viewers who understood and validated our experience helped heal the psychological damage caused by months of systematic gaslighting and cultural erasure. Seeing thousands of people recognize and condemn Jessica's behavior confirmed that our instincts about the harmfulness of her actions had been correct, despite her attempts to normalize and justify her appropriation. The educational impact of our story contributed to broader awareness about recognizing and preventing cultural appropriation in domestic settings, providing a template for documenting and exposing theft that occurred within family relationships where victims often felt obligated to tolerate exploitation rather than risk family conflicts. Our experience demonstrated that systematic documentation could provide the evidence needed to expose fraud definitively, rather than leaving situations as matters of competing interpretations. Community response included invitations for me to speak at cultural centers, cooking schools, and community colleges about traditional food preparation methods and the importance of accurate cultural attribution when sharing heritage recipes. These opportunities allowed me to reclaim my expertise publicly while educating others about authentic traditional techniques that had been developed through generations of practical experience rather than academic study or superficial observation. The teaching opportunities also provided platforms for discussing the broader implications of cultural appropriation in culinary contexts, helping younger generations understand the difference between respectful appreciation and exploitative theft when engaging with traditions that originated outside their own cultural backgrounds. These educational efforts felt particularly meaningful as they transformed our negative experience with Jessica's fraud into positive contributions to cultural preservation and protection. Michael's recovery process included active participation in these educational efforts, as he began accompanying me to speaking engagements and cooking demonstrations to share his perspective on recognizing manipulation and protecting family heritage from appropriation. His willingness to acknowledge his role in enabling Jessica's theft while working to prevent similar situations for other families demonstrated genuine growth and commitment to making amends for his previous blindness to her systematic fraud. David's video editing skills found new purpose in creating educational content about cultural appropriation and the importance of accurate documentation when preserving family traditions. He developed workshops about using technology to protect traditional knowledge while ensuring that cultural heritage was shared respectfully rather than stolen for personal gain. His technical expertise combined with our cultural knowledge created powerful tools for education and prevention. The broader family response included renewed commitment to actively teaching traditional cooking methods to younger generations, ensuring that cultural knowledge was transmitted directly rather than leaving gaps that could be exploited by opportunistic individuals seeking to appropriate heritage that didn't belong to them. Cousins, nieces, and nephews began participating more actively in holiday preparations, learning not just recipes but the stories and cultural context that gave those recipes meaning beyond simple ingredient lists. Extended family members who had witnessed Jessica's apparent expertise during previous gatherings expressed embarrassment about their praise and admiration for abilities she had fraudulently demonstrated. Several relatives mentioned feeling foolish for complimenting her cooking skills without recognizing that they were actually praising my techniques being performed by someone who had learned them through systematic appropriation, rather than legitimate cultural inheritance. The experience strengthened family bonds as relatives rallied around protecting our cultural heritage from future exploitation, while acknowledging their responsibility to pay closer attention to the sources of knowledge they encountered at family gatherings. The shared awareness of how easily appropriation could occur within trusted family settings created new vigilance about protecting traditional knowledge while still allowing for legitimate learning and cultural transmission. Neighborhood relationships also shifted as local friends who had attended Jessica's gatherings and praised her cooking abilities learned about the systematic fraud they had unknowingly supported through their compliments and encouragement. Several neighbors apologized for their role in validating Jessica's theft, expressing regret about not recognizing that they were praising stolen expertise while the actual source of that knowledge remained invisible and uncredited. The community response included increased interest in authentic cultural education, as neighbors and friends began asking direct questions about traditional cooking methods and requesting formal instruction rather than assuming they could learn through casual observation or social media research. The awareness raised by our experience created demand for legitimate cultural education that respected traditional knowledge while providing accurate attribution to its sources. Local restaurants and catering businesses also responded to our story by examining their own practices regarding cultural authenticity and proper attribution when serving traditional dishes from various cultural backgrounds. Several establishments reached out to discuss partnerships that would ensure their menu descriptions and preparation methods accurately represented the cultural traditions they claimed to honor rather than perpetuating misunderstandings or appropriation. The holiday season following Jessica's exposure felt different in fundamental ways, as family gatherings returned to their authentic purpose of celebrating shared heritage rather than providing stages for performance and appropriation. The absence of calculated observation and systematic documentation allowed for natural transmission of cultural knowledge without the underlying tension that had characterized every gathering during Jessica's residence. Thanksgiving dinner became a celebration of genuine cultural preservation and family bonding, with multiple generations participating in preparation while learning about the historical and cultural significance of traditional dishes. The stories shared during cooking were no longer intelligence being gathered for appropriation, but natural cultural transmission between family members who understood their responsibility to preserve and protect heritage knowledge. The recognition that our traditional knowledge was valuable and worthy of protection created new appreciation for the cultural wealth our family possessed through generations of preserved recipes, techniques, and stories. Rather than taking these traditions for granted, family members began actively documenting and preserving cultural knowledge while ensuring that any sharing was done with proper attribution and respect for its origins. Looking toward the future, our experience with Jessica's systematic appropriation has created lasting awareness about the importance of protecting cultural heritage while still allowing for legitimate sharing and appreciation. The lessons learned about recognizing manipulation and documenting fraud have application beyond culinary contexts, providing tools for identifying and preventing various forms of intellectual and cultural theft in personal and professional relationships. The ultimate legacy of our confrontation with cultural appropriation is not just the protection of our specific family traditions, but the broader education provided to thousands of people who witnessed Jessica's exposure and learned to recognize similar patterns of theft and manipulation in their own lives. Our story became a cautionary tale about the importance of vigilance in protecting cultural knowledge while providing hope that systematic fraud can be exposed and justice can be achieved through careful documentation and courageous action. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.